You wake to a sound, soft, deliberate brushstrokes. The room is dim, but the flickering of a candle casts long shadows across frescoed walls. You're still in Florence, but time has shuffled forward. Now you're sitting in the studio of Leonardo da Vinci himself. Yes, that Leonardo, the polymath genius, with a fascination for anatomy, flying machines, and mysterious smiles. But tonight, we're not here for inventions. We're here for secrets. Leonardo is hunched over a sketchbook, charcoal smudging his fingers as he draws the curve of a young man's neck. You notice the detail, the precise softness of the jawline, the lingering attention paid to the lips, the almost ethereal beauty in the eyes. And you're not the only one who sees it. Centuries later, art historians will flip through his notebook, squint at these studies, and ask who was this for. Here's a fact. Leonardo was once arrested twice, actually, for sodomy, the Renaissance era catch-all term for same-sex activity. He wasn't convicted, but the charges were real, and they left a mark. Historians still argue whether the accusations were part of a wider sting or the result of a personal vendetta, but the implication lingered in every corner of his life. After the arrests, Leonardo's notebooks go quieter on certain matters. There are no direct love letters, no obvious declarations of affection, but the images speak, and one name floats repeatedly to the surface: Gian Giacomo Caproti, also known as Salai. Salai, nicknamed the Little Devil, entered Leonardo's household as a boy and stayed for over 2 decades. He was messy, impish, sometimes thieving, but also inexplicably precious to Leonardo. He appears in countless sketches and paintings, often as mythological figures, Bacchus John the Baptist, or even an angelic trickster with an ambiguous smile. You can almost hear Leonardo's inner voice muttering, "If I can't say it, I'll draw it again and again until someone sees." One fringe theory even suggests that Salai, not Lisa Gherardini, was the true model for the Mona Lisa. The enigmatic smile, the softened facial structure. There's just enough androgyny there to raise questions. And if that theory makes you tilt your head a little and whisper, "Wait, what will welcome to the club?" This is where art history starts getting spicy. Leonardo wasn't alone in his coded affections. Michelangelo, yes, the guy who painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling while lying on scaffolding for 4 years, wrote hundreds of poems, and many of them were addressed to men. Not veiled allegories, but open, passionate verses full of longing and metaphysical admiration. One recipient was Tommaso de' Cavalieri, a Roman nobleman, half Michelangelo's age. The letters and sonnets he wrote to Tommaso read like the voice messages you never send at 2 a.m. sincere, vulnerable, a little too intense. "I'm filled with love for you," Michelangelo wrote. "A love that is stronger than death." Okay, drama king, but also same. The catch: Michelangelo's admirers, especially later biographers, weren't too comfy with all this overt affection between men. So over time, many of those poems were straightwashed. The masculine pronouns were swapped for feminine ones, and suddenly his gay love poetry became ambiguous odes to some mystery woman who suspiciously never existed. This quiet editing out wasn't just a one-time slip, it was systematic. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Renaissance artist queerness was being brushed away like dust from an old canvas. The narrative had to be clean, uplifting, palatable. But tonight, in the dim glow of your imagination, we're restoring what got erased. Michelangelo also sculpted male bodies with a near obsessive reverence. David, the ultimate Renaissance hunk, stands not just as a biblical hero, but as a master class in homoerotic admiration. The hands are enormous, the torso tense with potential energy, the gaze focused, vulnerable, and maybe even questioning. Is it courage? Is it desire? Or is it the look of someone who knows he's being watched by an artist who understands too well? Let's zoom out for a moment. Renaissance Italy wasn't exactly a liberal paradise, but it had weird flexibility. Certain acts were punished harshly, especially if you were poor or politically vulnerable. But among artists, nobles, and even clerics, there were quiet allowances. If you were talented, discreet, or well connected, the rules became a little fuzzier. Remember the Office of the Knight from Florence. They kept meticulous records of supposed sodomites, often based on rumors, anonymous tips, or public accusations. Those records, ironically, now provide some of the most detailed evidence of same sex relationships in the period. It's a little tragic, yes, but also wildly fascinating. These were people with names, addresses, and sometimes even occupations: butchers, bakers, goldsmiths, and yes, painters. You tiptoe across cobblestone streets at dusk, imagining how many of those footsteps belonged to people who loved differently, but dared to live anyway. The same walls that hid their secrets now cradle their stories. And not all resistance came in silence. Some artists pushed back. They created work so charged, so brazenly sensual, that the message didn't even try to hide. Take Caravaggio, a bit younger than our Renaissance guys, but worth slipping in here. His boy with a basket of fruit is practically smirking at you. The boy's gaze is intimate, the lighting dramatic, the sensuality impossible to ignore. Caravaggio wasn't trying to whisper, he was daring you to look. Historians still argue whether these themes were intentional provocations or just accidents of style, but when the same elements show up again and again — soft eyes, parted lips, closed bodies — you stop asking if it's coincidence and start asking, who were they painting for? The answer may be themselves, maybe their lovers, maybe someone in the future who'd finally understand. And now you're standing in front of a portrait, a young man with flushed cheeks and a slight smile holding a scroll. Nothing unusual until you notice the scroll is blank. No text, no emblem, just empty parchment. It's as if he's holding a message that couldn't be written then, but maybe, just maybe, is waiting for you to read now. You wander through corridors of oil paint and gold leaf, past saints and Madonnas, when suddenly a garden opens up before you. Roses climb trellises, fountains gurgle softly, and somewhere in the background, a lute hums out a sleepy tune. You've landed in 15th century Italy's softer counterpart. Its poetry, its allegories, its codes. Welcome to the world of Neoplatonic love. At first glance, Neoplatonism seems innocent enough. It's a school of thought that revives Plato's ideas about beauty, truth, and the soul's journey toward divine perfection. The Renaissance loved this stuff. Intellectuals waxed poetic about how gazing at someone beautiful could elevate the soul toward a purer spiritual realm. Sounds romantic, right? Maybe a little too romantic. Because here's the loophole this philosophy gave people, especially artists and poets, a license to admire the same sex intensely, intimately, while wrapping it all in noble, virtuous ribbons. If you ever wondered how two men writing steamy sonnets to each other got away with it, this was their shield. It wasn't desire, you see, it was admiration. Wink. You sit on a carved bench beside a young courtier, his hands trembling slightly as he reads aloud a verse by Marsilio Ficino, one of the movement's stars. Ficino taught that love between men was the most perfect kind, more rational, less chaotic, practically divine. In loving your friend, he whispers, eyes scanning yours, you glimpse the face of God. Is that Platonic? Maybe, maybe not. Take the poetry of Giovanni della Casa. He wrote a series of homoerotic verses so delicately phrased that censors didn't know what to do with them. One poem describes an unnamed youth whose voice enters the blood like wine. Another marvels at how the boy's beauty undoes the silence of the night. Subtle, yes. Deny it in court, subtle also, yes. This wasn't limited to the Italians. In Spain, poets at the court of King Ferdinand openly exchanged love poems with each other. In England, even before Shakespeare made sonnets sexy, there were whispers of male friendship so intense they felt like marriages. These relationships operated in a strange twilight, intimate, but not always consummated public, yet never fully spoken aloud. Historians still argue whether these bonds crossed into romance or were intense but platonic friendships warped by centuries of reinterpretation. The truth is probably both, or neither, or something deliciously in between. You stroll past a column covered in ivy where a shadowy figure waits. He hands you a slim book of poetry wrapped in silk and sealed with wax. Inside are coded verses, some in Greek, others in Latin, meant for eyes that knew how to read between the lines. This was common. Scholars, monks, and young courtiers often hid their truest words in classical allusions, so only the well read or the well in love would understand. Let's talk about symbols for a moment. Renaissance art and literature overflowed with them. Two doves, intimacy, a mirror, self love, or perhaps reflection between lovers. An intertwined laurel and oak, unity of opposites often used to suggest same sex harmony. Artists weren't just slipping in cute Easter eggs, they were building languages only some could decipher. Fringe fun fact: the color violet, now closely linked with LGBTQ plus pride, had its own quiet renaissance. In medieval and early modern times, violet or purple was associated with marginal identities, spiritual mysticism, and otherworldly love. Some queer coded poems referred to wearing violets in the heart, a subtle signal before handkerchief codes were even a thing. All this coded beauty, however, lived under the constant threat of erasure. A wrong word, a poorly timed letter, and someone might accuse you of unnatural acts. The laws were real, the punishments often brutal. But even more haunting was the social death reputation: lost careers, ruined names, wiped from legacies. Still, people loved anyway. Consider the Venetian painter Giorgione. We know frustratingly little about his life, but his paintings are full of soft, dreamy men in languid poses, often sharing space in curious intimacy. In The Sleeping Venus, a male figure was originally painted beside the goddess, later painted over, perhaps to keep things less suspicious. Restoration has tried to find him again, but like many things from this era, the traces are faint. You pause beside a tapestry where two figures identical in age and attire clasp hands beneath a tree. Their expressions are serene, their fingers touching so lightly it feels more spiritual than physical. But there it is again, the current of desire humming quietly beneath the silk. This is how queer love persisted, not through parades or proclamations, but through glances, gestures, and metaphors stacked like secret handshakes. Every sigh, every poem, every suspiciously close pose in a painting carried a story waiting to be unwrapped. Modern scholars keep peeling back these layers. Some reject the idea of a gay renaissance, insisting that it's too modern a label for too ancient a truth. Others argue passionately that queerness, fluid, complex, hidden, was always there, simply encoded in the aesthetics of the age. Meanwhile, the art keeps smiling its mysterious smiles, as if to say, "You're close, keep going." And you do. You press further into a corridor lined with portraits. Some of the eyes seem to follow you, not in warning, but in welcome. They know why you're here. They know what you're searching for. In one corner hangs a small, easily ignored painting, two men leaning against each other backs, to the viewer gazing at a sunset. No title, no known artist, but it speaks in volumes. Maybe it was once part of a private collection tucked behind velvet drapes. Maybe it survived because no one thought to question it. You pause, you breathe, and you begin to understand that the Renaissance didn't just birth science, art, and reason. It nurtured longing, coded desire, and whispered affection into places where it was never supposed to bloom. But bloom it did. You're still walking the marble corridors of time, but now the ceilings get higher, the rooms darker, and the shadows richer. Welcome to the courtly Renaissance, the world of secret letters, sly portraits, and patronage as a form of flirtation. It's time to peek behind the velvet curtains of elite society, where queer relationships thrived, not despite the rules, but because of the ways people learned to dance around them. Let's start in Florence, because honestly, where else? The city was practically the gay capital of 15th century Europe, though no one would dare call it that. In public, there were laws, lots of them, against sodomy, which was the catch all term used at the time for any kind of sexual behavior deemed unnatural by the church. But in private, especially among the elite, things were different. You attend a masked ball in a candlelit palace, where young men in flowing silk exchange lingering glances beneath feathered masks. This isn't just theater, it's strategy. In a world that banned open affection between men, the masquerade became a place where longing wore a costume and secrets had music to waltz to. One name dances through these corridors more than most: Leonardo da Vinci. You hear the faint scratching of his quill as he sketches not just flying machines and anatomical marvels, but young men, dozens of them. His notebooks are filled with idealized male figures, many nude, many labeled with affectionate little nicknames. His longtime companion, Gian Giacomo Caprotti, nicknamed Salai, meaning little devil, was with him for over 2 decades, despite stealing money, breaking things, and generally causing chaos. But Leonardo kept him close, painted him into several works, and left him a portion of his estate. Historians still argue whether theirs was a romantic relationship or merely one of dependency, but let's be honest, you don't let a petty thief hang around for 25 years without some kind of soft spot. Salai's curly hair, mischievous smile, and slender figure show up in many of Leonardo's artworks, from St. John the Baptist to the suspiciously sensual Bacchus. You wonder, was this art or love in disguise? Probably both. Now shift to another titan of Renaissance art, Michelangelo. He loved the male form with a kind of obsessive reverence. His letters and poetry, yes, he wrote poetry, and lots of it often brim with adoration for beautiful men. In one sonnet, he laments that the flesh leads me to what I most abhor, a painfully honest confession of the tension between his religious guilt and physical desire. He once referred to a young man named Tommaso de Cavalieri as the light of our century, and their preserved correspondence reads like a slow-burning romance novel written in iambic pentameter. Still, scholars disagree. Some call it spiritual mentorship, others call it a veiled love affair. You read the words and decide for yourself, "I am filled with love for you more than I understand." There's a pattern here, isn't there? The elite often had the resources to hide things in plain sight. They commissioned art that hinted wrote poetry, that winked and used wealth and position to shield themselves from the full consequences of societal judgment. Of course, it didn't always work. Even in the Medici ruled Florence, young men could be arrested, fined, and even tortured for same sex relations. Florence's ufficiali di notte, or officers of the night, were a special police force created solely to investigate sodomy. Thousands of men were tried, and records were kept in obsessive detail. It's one of the reasons we know so much about queer life at the time. Ironically, these same records reveal a culture more tolerant than you might expect. Many cases were dropped. Accusations were often anonymous. Punishments varied wildly. It seems that while the laws were harsh on paper, their enforcement was patchy, especially if you were rich or connected. Remember, society's rules don't always match its reality. Now, hop across the Alps to France and England, where the Renaissance took on a more royal flavor. In the courts of King James I of England and Henri III of France, male favorites wielded enormous influence and inspired intense gossip. James was especially open about his affections, once writing to his lover George Villiers, "I desire only to live in your heart, die in your arms, subtle not really, but royal absolutely." Portraits of George Villiers show a man drenched in luxury pearls, lace velvet, and painted with an intimacy that makes you feel like an intruder just by looking. This was queer power, styled in brocade and framed in gilt. Even in Spain, where the Inquisition cast its long shadow letters, survive between male courtiers expressing love that tiptoes dangerously close to romantic confession. One nobleman wrote to another, "I have loved you beyond reason, beyond duty, beyond what my soul can carry." But don't get too cozy. People were still burned for less. But oh, the art. Look closer at commissioned works during this time, and you'll see a quiet rebellion. Artists included male nudes, lounging together, glances between saints that burn a bit too brightly, and mythological figures frozen in embraces that didn't need to be so lingering. Oh, one such piece, a version of Ganymede and Zeus, where the young cupbearer is lifted skyward in the god's arms, looking more seduced than abducted. You stare and you can't help but smirk. Nice try, guys. We see you. A quirky detail. During this time, artists often coded gender using flowers. A white lily might suggest chastity, but a red carnation that was the symbol of lovers. Guess which flower shows up in the hands of young men in dozens of Renaissance portraits? Yep, carnations for days. As you float through this lush, perfumed world of silk and secrecy, you begin to understand that courtly Renaissance life wasn't just about survival, it was about subversion. Every poem, every portrait, every carefully phrased letter was part of a long, slow waltz around power and desire. It's a performance, yes, but one with teeth. You look around and wonder how many of these paintings you've seen before, never noticing the glance that touched the hidden message. How many love stories got folded into the background while you admired the brushwork? Not tonight. Tonight you see them, all of them. You press forward the scent of turpentine and damp stone fading behind you. The Renaissance, with its velvet shadows, gives way to something sharper, less indulgent, more ideological. Now you're in the Enlightenment, that glittering age of reason and revolution's powdered wigs and political salons. But while philosophers scribble about liberty and science, you start to notice something strange. People are still talking in code. By now, the queer undercurrent has gone underground deeper than ever. Love letters are written in mirror script, art is stripped of overt affection, and social gatherings evolve into coded circles of confirmed bachelors and ladies of refined taste. You walk into a candlelit drawing room in 18th century Paris, and the air practically vibrates with theater and tension. Think lace cuffs, double entendres, and a suspicious number of Greco Roman busts. One of those busts, the god Antinous Emperor Hadrian's beloved companion, whose image becomes a full blown queer icon for Enlightenment thinkers who admire antiquity just a little too much. His sculptures are everywhere, and everyone pretends it's because of the classical ideal. Sure, Jan. In this world, queerness starts wearing the mask of aestheticism. Certain men, wealthy, bookish, always quoting Plato, cultivate a reputation for refined taste and poetic friendship. These romantic friendships flourish particularly among intellectuals. Letters between men drip with affection and longing. It's a dance, passionate, coded, and utterly deniable if anyone raises an eyebrow. Consider Horace Walpole, a British aristocrat historian and the guy who basically invented the Gothic novel, never married, lived with male friends, decorated his home like a haunted Versailles. His letters to Thomas Gray and William Mason are so flowery they'd make a Victorian swoon. Historians still debate whether Walpole was gay asexual or simply eccentric, but let's just say his Strawberry Hill house wasn't exactly brimming with heterosexual energy. Meanwhile, in Germany, a man named Karl Heinrich Ulrichs is born. You'll want to remember him. As a young man, he feels what he calls an inner female nature, and he writes under a pseudonym about same-sex desire in Greek myth. He coins the term earning, a self-descriptor for male individuals attracted to other men, and builds one of the earliest scientific frameworks for understanding queerness as innate rather than sinful. Yeah, he's ahead of his time by, about a century. But it's not all salons and sonnets. The legal noose is tightening. In England, the Buggery Act of 1533 is still very much in effect, thanks for nothing Henry VIII, and it's being enforced with increasing cruelty. Sodomy is a capital offense. Between 1806 and 1835, alone over 400 men are sentenced to death in England for same-sex acts. Some are hanged, others are pilloried. Still others are simply ruined, exiled, or imprisoned until they disappear. One infamous case burns in your memory: the trial of Captain Robert Jones in 1772, a decorated naval officer accused of sodomy with a teenage boy. Newspapers cover every sordid detail. Jones denies nothing, just pleads for mercy. The court allows him to flee to France, where he vanishes into obscurity. But the public spectacle, the mockery, and the underlying panic, those linger. Still, queer people adapt. You visit clandestine molly houses in London, small, dimly lit taverns, where men dressed in women's clothes flirt, kiss, and sometimes stage mock marriages. One such place is run by Margaret Clapp Mother Clapp to her patrons, who offers shelter and community until she's arrested in 1726. Her name becomes synonymous with queer solidarity, and yes, she was cisgender straight and still risked everything to protect queer lives. ally alert. You step out into the night air, sticky with coal smoke and anxiety, and feel a flicker of resilience. These people aren't just surviving, they're building culture connection and even politics, quietly, carefully, sometimes flamboyantly. One fringe tidbit. Some molly houses even had their own lexicon, a secret vocabulary where Betty might mean any gay man, and to swab was code for a kiss. Call it Queer Esperanto 18th Century Edition. Then there's France. Post revolution things get complicated. The Napoleonic Code, established in 1804, does not criminalize homosexual acts between consenting adults, making France a queer haven, at least on paper. But public decency laws are wielded like fly swatters used to punish anyone who gets too visible. It's legal, just don't let anyone see you. A familiar rule, right? Meanwhile, salons in Paris bloom like peonies. Aristocrats, writers, and intellectuals gather to talk science, poetry, and romance. Women like Anne Lister, yes, that Anne Lister travel across Europe, keeping coded diaries of their passionate affairs with other women. Her secret code, a blend of algebra and ancient Greek, obsessed yet historians still argue whether Enlightenment philosophy helped or hurt queer visibility. On one hand, thinkers like Rousseau and Voltaire questioned traditional morality and religion, clearing intellectual space for difference. On the other, their emphasis on natural behavior sometimes got weaponized to define queerness as unnatural, mixed bag, really. So you sit in a paneled library, sipping imaginary port, watching as reason dances with repression. This age of enlightenment is filled with shadows. Secrets echo through marble halls. Affection hides behind prose, but it's all there if you know where to look. And look you do. You see the longing pressed into a diary's spine. You see it in a broken wax seal, a statue's hip curve, a half-burnt letter in the fireplace. You see it in the footnotes of history, the erased names, the lovers who vanished together. And most of all, you see it in the places where people gathered illicit, joyful, terrified, and said to one another, "You are not alone," that more than any law or philosophy is what survives. You leave the Enlightenment behind with your boots a little more worn and your heart a little heavier. But now you step into the 19th century Victorian times, and if you thought things were repressed before, get ready. You're entering the era of corsets so tight they could crack ribs and social etiquette so rigid it could shatter glass. This is the age of empire manners and moral panic. The Industrial Revolution hums in the background, spitting soot into the sky, while new ideas about gender sexuality and class swirl like factory smoke. And in this beautifully buttoned up mess, queer identity is starting to crystallize, not publicly, not comfortably, but clearly. You walk through the gaslit streets of London, where horse-drawn carriages clatter past top-hatted men and parasol-twirling ladies. But underneath the silk and soot, something's happening, something quieter and braver. Meet Anne Lister again. Yes, she's back, and this time she's not just traveling. She's writing encoded diaries. Thousands of pages hidden in algebraic scrawl. Historians would nearly pass them over if they hadn't been cracked in the 20th century. And when you read them, you blush. She writes about seduction, heartbreak, pride, and even her marriage to Anne Walker. That's right, a secret wedding ring and all performed in a church with only God as their witness? Take that Victorian norms. But don't mistake bravery for safety. The noose is still real. In Britain, the infamous Labouchere Amendment of 1885 criminalizes gross indecency between men, a vague phrase with devastating power. It doesn't just punish acts, it punishes identity. You don't even need to be caught in the act anymore. Just a letter, a rumor, or a coded note could destroy you. A trapdoor law waiting to swallow queer lives whole. Enter Oscar Wilde. You can't walk 3 steps in queer history without brushing the hem of his green carnation. Wilde is flamboyant, witty, and utterly brilliant. His plays mock Victorian hypocrisy with such charm it stings. He's adored by high society until he's not. In 1895, Wilde sues the Marquess of Queensberry, his lover's father, for libel after being accused of sodomy. Bad move. The trial turns against him, and he's sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. In prison, he writes De Profundis, a long, aching letter to his former lover. His health crumbles, his reputation shatters. He dies a few years later, broke and exiled in France. His tomb in Père Lachaise Cemetery, now covered in lipstick kisses. Historians still debate whether Wilde's downfall was inevitable, or if he could have slipped by had he lived more discreetly. But you know what? Discretion isn't Wilde's style. He lived out loud even when it cost him everything. And somewhere in that defiance, a new kind of visibility is born. But not all queer stories from this time end in tragedy. You follow the scent of coffee into a Viennese cafe, where Magnus Hirschfeld is scribbling notes. A German Jewish doctor and sexologist, he founds the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in 1897, arguably the first modern LGBTQ plus rights organization. Their slogan, Justice Through Science. Hirschfeld believes queerness is a natural biological variant, not a sin or a crime. He gathers data, publishes studies, and even campaigns to repeal anti-sodomy laws in Germany. Oh, and he also opens the Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin. Inside a public museum of sexuality, a massive archive, and wait for it, a clinic offering gender-affirming care, including some of the earliest documented gender transition surgeries in history. It's 1919. Let that settle. But Hirschfeld's work isn't just medical, it's cultural. He coins terms like transvestite in the context of gender expression and tries to build understanding across a vast spectrum of identities. For many, he's the first to say, "You're not broken, you're human." Of course, not everyone likes that message. His institute is ransacked and burned by Nazis in 1933. Hirschfeld himself dies in exile, but the knowledge he gathered, the lives he touched, the seeds he planted, those survive. Meanwhile, over in America, queer life is bubbling under the surface. You wander into the salons of Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. Jazz spills from open doors. Laughter rolls like thunder. Queer black artists like Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, and Langston Hughes are thriving, coded but vibrant. They sing of love and loss, desire and defiance. It's not always safe, but it's electric. One fringe tidbit, the pansy craze of the 1920s and early 30s. In cities like New York and San Francisco, drag performers and openly gay entertainers draw crowds. Imagine a smoky speakeasy where a man in sequins sings torch songs while the audience claps in rhythm. These acts weren't just tolerated, they were trendy. Until, of course, the cultural pendulum swung back with prohibition and conservative backlash. But by now, the idea of community is forming, slowly, secretly, like a fingerprint under glass. You look around and see it coded rings, pinky swears letters tucked in novels, private salons, and public scandals. Everything is precarious, yet nothing is erased. Queer people are loving laughing, creating, and most of all, remembering. Historians still argue how out you could be in this era. Some say visibility meant ruin. Others point to coded resilience as its own form of defiance. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the middle, not just in Oscar Wilde's silk waistcoats or Ann Lister's iron handwriting, but in the quiet spaces between them where queer life pulses, refuses, survives. And as you move toward the 20th century, with wars looming and revolutions stirring, one thing becomes clear: visibility isn't just risky anymore, it's political. You wake up in the thick of the 20th century, somewhere between ration coupons and radio crackle. The world is now at war again, twice, in fact, and amid all the marching boots and mushroom clouds, queerness is still here, still whispering, but now it's starting to shout. You find yourself in Berlin in the early 1930s, just before things go black and red with swastikas. Remember Magnus Hirschfeld and his groundbreaking Institute for Sexual Research? Yeah, the Nazis burned it, literally. Thousands of books, medical records, and letters went up in flames. The Nazis labeled homosexuality as degenerate and lumped it into their vast machinery of persecution. Pink triangles were stitched onto concentration camp uniforms, an identifier for gay men. Some died. Many were rehabilitated through torture medical experiments or forced labor. And here's the dark fringe fact: after the war, survivors wearing pink triangles were not recognized as victims. In some cases, they were re-imprisoned under existing anti-sodomy laws. That's how deep the silence ran. But even here, queer resistance existed. Stories trickle out of secret love affairs among soldiers. Lesbian networks hide their identities through marriage or camouflage. Queer people exist in the margins of this horrific landscape, and somehow, incredibly, they endure. As the dust of Wallatuatu settles, a new kind of world order emerges. The United Nations, the Cold War, McCarthyism. Cue the jazz soundtrack, chain smoking in diners, and atomic age paranoia, but also the slow rise of LGBTQ plus political organizing. In 1950s, America being gay is officially pathologized. The American Psychiatric Association lists homosexuality as a mental disorder. Meanwhile, President Eisenhower signs an executive order banning sexual perverts from working in federal government. Just imagine filling out your civil service application and wondering if your haircut looks too gay. This is the Lavender Scare, McCarthyism's lesser-known cousin. Thousands of queer federal employees are investigated, interrogated, and fired, all in the name of national security. Why? Because queer people they claimed were susceptible to blackmail. You can't make this up. But here's the thing: repression breeds resistance. A few brave folks are done hiding. Meet Harry Hay, a Communist Party member and labor activist. In 1950, he founds the Mattachine Society, One of the first sustained gay rights organizations in the US, his mission: create a space where gay men can feel solidarity and start asking bigger questions. Like, why are we illegal? Why are we ashamed? Over on the East Coast, you've got the Daughters of Bilitis, founded in 1955 by lesbian couples who just want to dance, talk, and exist without fear of arrest. They publish newsletters, host discussion groups, and even go toe to toe with psychiatrists. Historians still argue about how radical these early groups were. Some say they were assimilationist, trying to fit into straight society with suits, pearls, and cautious language. Others argue that even asking for basic respect in that climate was revolutionary. Either way, they cracked the silence wide open. Then, boom, the 1960s. You can practically smell the patchouli and revolution in the air. The civil rights movement, second wave feminism, anti war protests. It's all bubbling up, and queer folks are watching closely. They're marching too, even if no one sees them yet. One night in 1966, you're sitting in a San Francisco cafe called Compton's. It's late. Drag queens, trans women, and queer youth gather around plastic booths and cups of bad coffee. And then the cops come in again. They harass, they shove, and this time, someone throws coffee in a cop's face. Chairs fly, windows shatter. You wide eyed duck under a table and think something is happening. That's the Compton's cafeteria riot, years before Stonewall, and it marks one of the first known collective acts of resistance by trans women in America. But it barely makes a ripple in the national news. Yet in queer history, it matters. It always mattered. The 1960s roll toward their iconic crescendo, and you're standing outside the Stonewall Inn in June 1969. It's hot, muggy. Judy Garland has just died, and emotions are strange and tender in the air. The police raid the bar, it's standard practice. But tonight, no one runs. A butch lesbian punches a cop. A high heel flies. Bricks are thrown. The riot stretches into days. You walk among the crowd, drag queens, homeless queer youth bar regulars, allies. People start chanting, and for the first time in a long time, the world hears. Historians still debate who threw the first punch: Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, Stormy DeLarvery. But honestly, the question misses the point. It wasn't one person. It was everyone who'd had enough. Stonewall becomes a touchstone, not because it was the first act of queer resistance, but because it finally grabbed the microphone. The year after, in 1970, the first Pride marches take place in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. You walk with them on heart pounding. People chant, sing, and cry. Some wear paper bags over their heads. Others hold hands for the first time in public. It's not just protest, it's reclamation. You take one last look back at the century's midpoint and realize queerness is no longer confined to coded novels and whispered rumors. It's marching, it's rioting, it's organizing. From pink triangles to rainbow flags, from psychiatric diagnoses to defiant parades, the journey has been brutal but undeniable. And the 1970s, they're just getting started. The 1970s aren't just bell bottoms and disco, they're a neon colored turning point. You feel it as soon as you step into the streets. The queer movement is no longer content with shadowy corners and whispered solidarity. It's loud, it's out, It's political, and you, my friend, are marching right through it. You pass bookstores with titles like The Advocate and Come Out stacked proudly in the windows. Zines flyers and posters bloom on telephone poles. You attend consciousness raising groups in someone's apartment where folks sit in circles, sip instant coffee, and talk about identity shame, sex, and survival like it's the most revolutionary act in the world, because at the time it is. In 1973, you sit nervously in the back row of a psychiatric conference, heart pounding. On stage, a psychiatrist with a voice modulating mask speaks into the mic. He's gay and a member of the American Psychiatric Association, but he can't risk revealing his identity. His testimony helps push the APA to finally declassify homosexuality as a mental disorder. That's right, 1973. Until then, you were literally considered ill. Suddenly, you're just you and not sick. And this same year, a fringe nugget for your trivia bank homosexual behavior is still technically banned in the Boy Scouts handbook until the mid 1970s. Historians still argue whether institutional policies like this reflected cultural paranoia or were designed to keep funding intact. Either way, they sent a very clear message to queer youth: not here. But back on the streets, you see something else blooming: pride. Not just parades, but a mindset. San Francisco becomes the heartbeat of the movement. You meet Harvey Milk, a camera store owner turned politician, who becomes the first openly gay elected official in California. His speeches fire, his hope contagious. You watch as he tells a crowd, "You've got to give them hope." You chant back, "You believe." And then on a rainy November day in 1978, he's murdered, assassinated alongside Mayor George Moscone by a disgruntled colleague. The candlelight vigil stretches for miles. The grief is oceanic, and yet from it rises something stronger. The rainbow flag, designed that same year by artist Gilbert Baker, waves high above the crowd. Each color has a meaning: red for life, orange for healing yellow, for sunlight, green for nature, blue for serenity, and purple for spirit. And yes, there were originally two more, turquoise and hot pink, but those were eventually dropped due to fabric shortages. You can't make this stuff up. Pride becomes more than a protest. It becomes a ritual. Every June, cities light up. Drag queens strut. Allies show up. Families sometimes reluctantly join. And all of it is a love letter to survival. But with visibility comes backlash. You find yourself watching the rise of Anita Bryant, a former beauty queen and orange juice spokesperson who spearheads a campaign to repeal gay rights ordinances in Florida. She calls it Save Our Children. The subtext: queer people are a threat. The irony: her campaign leads to some of the first large-scale boycotts against a brand, Florida orange juice, and you suddenly realize queer folks are organizing economically now too. Restaurants start putting up signs. "We serve Anita Bryant squeezed." You chuckle. Even rage comes with wit. And here's a curious side note: in 1979, the first National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights takes place. Nearly 100,000 people show up. The demands straightforward and bold: equal rights, repeal of anti-gay laws, and protection from discrimination. But within the organizing ranks, tensions stir. Some lesbians feel sidelined. Bisexuals and transgender people are still fighting to even be mentioned. Historians still debate whether the movement fractured here or simply evolved. Either way, you're watching something enormous take shape, a community learning to include itself even when it stumbles. You end the decade dancing in a smoky club under spinning mirror balls Donna Summer echoing in your chest. But you're not just partying, you're existing, and that, in a society that still wants to legislate your love, is nothing short of defiance. And then the 1980s approach, like the opening notes of a horror film. The first whispers come quietly, a rare cancer seen in gay men. By 1981, those whispers turn to screams. The AIDS crisis hits. The joyful roar of pride gives way to protests, funerals, and an avalanche of silence from the powers that be. But that's a storm waiting on the next horizon. Right now, in this fleeting moment, you see yourself surrounded by people who've carved space out of concrete. You've marched beside them, mourned with them, danced alongside them. You've learned the power of naming yourself loving loudly and showing up even when history refused to. The revolution isn't over. It's only just getting its glittery boots on. You can't shake the feeling that something's wrong. It's early 1981. You're reading the paper over burnt toast, and there's a story buried on page 19, rare cancer, seen in 41 homosexuals. You reread it confused, then anxious, then numb. A few weeks later, another story. More men, mostly in New York and San Francisco, all developing strange symptoms. Kaposi's sarcoma pneumocystis pneumonia. Most are young, most are gay, most are dying. You're in a clinic, maybe volunteering, maybe just visiting a friend, when a nurse whispers what everyone's thinking, but no one wants to say out loud, "This is a plague." They don't even know what to call it yet. GRID, they say, gay related immune deficiency, as if the virus itself checks your sexual orientation before moving in. The name will change soon to AIDS. The fire spreads faster than the virus. You watch as hospital staff wear gloves and masks around gay men, but not other patients. Whole wings of hospitals become ghost towns. Families refuse to visit. Lovers lie and say they're just roommates to be allowed inside. And then there's the silence, deafening. The President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, doesn't even say the word AIDS publicly until 1985, after tens of thousands are dead. Historians still argue whether the government's apathy was fueled by ignorance bureaucracy or outright homophobia. Probably a toxic cocktail of all three. In the midst of that silence, you see others getting loud. ACT UP. AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power is born. Its motto is a war cry, silence =death. You march in die-ins, lying down in public places, mimicking the corpses the world refuses to see. You storm FDA offices demanding faster drug approval. You chant until your voice breaks, and you meet people like Larry Kramer. He's furious. He yells at politicians, at drug companies, at other activists. Some call him abrasive, some call him necessary. He helps form the gay men's health crisis and later ACT UP. One time he tells you, well, the crowd, but you feel it personally. We are in the middle of ****ing plague, and nobody acts as if it is. That sentence burns in your memory like a siren under your skin. But amidst the pain and protest, there's creativity. The AIDS Memorial Quilt begins in 1987. You stitch a panel maybe for a lover, maybe a friend, maybe someone you only met once but couldn't forget. Each square is a story sewn in grief, defiance, and love. The first time it's displayed, it covers the National Mall like a giant fabric heartbeat. And while the mainstream media mostly shrugs, art doesn't. Artists like David Wojnarowicz and Keith Haring scream onto canvas. Their work is bold, angry, urgent. You stand in front of one of Haring's murals, his neon figures practically vibrating off the wall. He's painting joy while dying. You feel that contradiction in your bones. A quirky tidbit in 1985, the movie The Goonies features a blink and you miss it moment. A gay slur gets tossed out, totally normalized. That same year, Rock Hudson, the classic Hollywood heartthrob, dies of AIDS. It's a shock to the system. Suddenly, people who wouldn't even say gay are talking about the epidemic. Fear, it seems, travels faster through fame. You remember 1987 vividly, when the US bans HIV positive people from entering the country, just bans them. People are turned away at customs detained deported, and the ban stays in place until 2010. Yeah, 2010. Historians still debate the motive. Was it public health or public relations? Meanwhile, churches argue over what to say. Some say it's divine punishment. Others open their doors. You find sanctuary in a few, maybe even light a candle in one unsure if it's for prayer or protest. By now, you're attending more funerals than birthdays. You keep a drawer full of obituary clippings. You've memorized the smell of lilies. You've learned to hold a stranger's hand as they slip away because no one else will. But you've also learned what love looks like when there's nothing left to prove. You see lovers bathing partners too weak to move, friends starting care networks, drag queens sewing meals into casseroles. The queer community becomes a self sustaining organism, its own immune system. And even as fear and loss define the decade, so does resistance. You stop trying to be palatable. You stop begging for acceptance. You start demanding survival. By 1989, the Berlin Wall is crumbling, but in America, your own wall of shame, of stigma, of systemic neglect is still standing strong. You and your community keep swinging at it, brick by brick. You still remember a friend's joke? At least with this much funeral experience, I'll never have to pay for a wedding planner. You both laughed too hard at that one. You had to. By the end of the 80s, something shifts. People are angry, yes, but they're also organized, smarter, strategic. You feel it in the meetings, in the marches, in the music. You hear it in Madonna's Like a Prayer, a song that becomes an unofficial anthem. In 1989, she slips condoms into her album packaging. The Vatican's not amused. Neither are you. You're busy. You're still fighting. The decade closes with you worn down but not worn out. You've seen the worst, lost the most, and yet you're still here, somehow. The 90s are coming, and they bring both change and contradiction.